No one survives the crack of a glacier unless something chooses to let them. The moment David Carter's boots broke through the frozen surface of the mountain ridge, everything beneath him collapsed without warning. He fell into a narrow, vertical abyss carved deep inside the glacier, the walls of ice glowing faint blue as he tumbled downward. The air turned instantly sharp, stealing breath from his lungs as his body slammed against frozen stone and jagged ice formations. Above him, the storm erased all light, sealing the surface world as if it had never existed. David lay stunned at the bottom of the ice shaft, his breath shallow, his gloves torn, and his vision fading in and out from the extreme cold. Every instinct told him to move, but the freezing pressure of the abyss made even lifting an arm feel impossible. He whispered for help, but the sound disappeared into thick silence. Minutes felt like hours. Then something changed. A faint vibration traveled through the ice above him, subtle at first, then deliberate, like something walking across the frozen surface. David looked up through the narrow opening of the abyss and saw movement against the storm. A shape, large, steady. It did not rush. It did not hesitate. A leopard stood at the edge of the fracture, its body perfectly still as it looked directly down into the void where David lay trapped. Snow whipped violently around its silhouette, but it did not turn away. Instead, it began to move along the edge of the crack, step by step, as if studying the structure of the ice itself. David could not understand what he was seeing. No predator should have been here. No animal should have approached a collapsing glacier during a storm of this scale. Yet the leopard remained, circling the perimeter of the abyss, its presence strangely synchronized with shifts in the wind. Whenever it paused, the snow seemed to slow. Whenever it moved, the ice groaned faintly, as if responding. David tried to climb again, forcing his frozen hands into the wall, but the ice shattered under his grip, and he fell back down, weaker than before. Above him, the leopard stopped. It lowered its body, pressing close to the edge, watching the depth below with an intensity that felt almost deliberate. Then, without warning, the snow above shifted and a narrow collapse of ice created a fragile opening, just enough for light to filter deeper into the abyss. David blinked through the brightness, unsure if it was real or the result of his fading consciousness. The leopard did not leave. It remained at the edge, motionless, as if waiting for something to begin. David Carter had no idea how long he had been trapped inside the frozen abyss beneath the glacier, but time no longer behaved like something measurable, only like pressure building inside his chest with every breath that grew thinner and more painful. The world above him had disappeared completely, replaced by a narrow vertical column of ice that reflected faint blue light, like a distant memory of the surface he had fallen from. His hands were numb beyond sensation, his jacket stiff with frost, and his movements reduced to slow, fragmented attempts to stay conscious rather than escape. Every sound was swallowed instantly by the ice walls, leaving only silence so deep it felt physical. Above, the storm continued without pause, unseen but constantly felt through vibrations traveling through the glacier. Then, faintly at first, a pattern emerged in those vibrations, something different from natural shifting ice. David lifted his head slowly, forcing his eyes upward through the narrow fracture above him. The leopard was still there. It had not left. It paced along the rim of the abyss with controlled precision, its movements steady and deliberate, as if it was measuring the structure of the ice rather than simply observing it. Snow swirled violently around its body, yet it remained anchored at the edge, refusing to retreat from the storm. David's mind struggled to process what he was seeing, because the presence of the animal did not feel accidental anymore. It felt intentional. Whenever the leopard paused, the wind above seemed to soften for a fraction of a second. Whenever it moved, faint shifts traveled through the ice walls, subtle but distinct, like the glacier itself was responding. David tried once again to pull himself upward, scraping his frozen gloves against the ice, but the surface collapsed under his grip and he slid back down into the cold darkness. His strength was nearly gone. His breathing slowed to shallow intervals that no longer felt reliable. Above him, the leopard stopped moving entirely. It lowered its body closer to the edge, staring down into the abyss with unwavering focus. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the ice above shifted again, not violently but structurally, as if pressure was being redistributed across the fracture. A narrow opening formed, allowing a thin stream of pale light to reach deeper into the shaft. David blinked slowly, unsure if his eyes were still interpreting reality correctly or if the environment itself had begun to change. The leopard did not leave. It remained positioned at the edge, perfectly still, as if waiting for a response from the world below. David Carter remained trapped inside the vertical ice abyss, suspended in a silence so complete it felt as if the glacier had removed him from the world entirely rather than simply buried him beneath it. The thin column of fractured ice above him no longer felt like an escape route, but like a distant and unreachable boundary separating life from disappearance. His body had entered a state of slow decline, where movement required deliberate mental effort, and even breathing felt like pulling air through frozen resistance. The cold had stripped away sensation from his limbs, leaving only a dull awareness that he was still alive by a margin too small to measure. Above him, faint light continued to filter through the narrow opening created earlier, but it was unstable, shifting as the storm altered pressure across the glacier's surface. David's eyes remained fixed upward, drawn not by hope, but by the inability to look away from the only sign of change in an otherwise static world. Then the leopard appeared again at the edge of the fracture. It moved with controlled precision, stepping into view as if it had never left its position. The animal did not display urgency or hesitation. Instead, it circled the rim of the abyss in a slow, deliberate pattern, each movement measured and consistent, as though it was tracing invisible lines embedded within the ice structure itself. Snow swept violently across its body, but it remained anchored at the edge, unaffected by the instability surrounding it. David watched in silence, his mind struggling to assign meaning to what he was witnessing. The leopard's presence no longer resembled random wildlife behavior. It appeared synchronized with subtle environmental changes, as if the storm responded to its movement rather than the other way around. When the leopard paused, the air above the fracture seemed to settle for brief moments. When it advanced, the ice emitted faint structural shifts, like pressure redistributing through hidden pathways within the glacier. David attempted once more to climb, dragging himself toward the narrow wall of ice with what remained of his strength, but the surface fractured again under minimal force, and he slid back down, unable to gain elevation. His breathing grew slower, each inhale shorter than the last, as consciousness began to fragment under the combined effects of cold and exhaustion. Above him, the leopard suddenly stopped moving. It lowered its body closer to the edge, peering directly into the abyss with a level of focus that felt intentional rather than instinctive. For a long moment, nothing changed except the wind outside the glacier. Then the structure above shifted again, not through collapse, but through controlled redistribution, as if unseen pressure was being redirected across the fracture system. A thin but stable channel of light extended deeper into the abyss, illuminating sections of the ice wall that had previously been completely dark. David blinked slowly, unable to determine whether the change was real or a final distortion of perception. The leopard remained at the edge, unmoving, as though it was waiting for something below to respond before the next stage of whatever process was unfolding could begin. David Carter remained inside the frozen vertical abyss beneath the glacier, where time had lost any recognizable structure and the world above existed only as distant pressure transmitted through shifting ice. His body had reached a state of near immobility, not from choice, but from the overwhelming force of cold that reduced every movement into something deliberate and costly. The narrow shaft of fractured ice above him continued to provide faint, unstable illumination, but it no longer felt like a path or an opening, only like a reminder of how far separated he was from anything resembling survival. Each breath he took felt thinner than the last, as if the air itself was being extracted from his reach. Yet his awareness remained strangely intact, anchored by a presence he could no longer ignore. Above the abyss, the leopard remained at the edge of the fracture. It had not left. Its behavior had shifted into a pattern that felt increasingly structured rather than instinctive. It moved along the perimeter of the opening with slow, deliberate steps, pausing at specific intervals as if responding to invisible markers within the ice. Snow swept violently around its body, but its position remained stable, as though the storm's intensity diminished within a narrow radius surrounding it. David watched in silence. His perception narrowed to the small portion of the world still visible through the fractured opening. The leopard's movements appeared increasingly synchronized with subtle changes in the glacier structure. When it advanced, faint vibrations traveled through the ice walls. When it paused, the airflow through the shaft stabilized briefly, allowing light to penetrate deeper into the abyss. These changes were not dramatic, but they were consistent enough to form a pattern that resisted simple explanation. David attempted once more to move upward, pressing his hands against the frozen wall, but the ice fractured under minimal pressure, and he fell back into the lower section of the shaft, his strength now reduced to fragments of effort rather than sustained motion. His breathing slowed further, and his awareness of time began to blur, as if the abyss itself was compressing his perception into smaller and smaller intervals. Above him, the leopard stopped moving again. It lowered its body closer to the edge of the fracture, focusing downward with unwavering attention. The surrounding snow appeared to shift in response to its stillness, settling into temporary patterns that revealed the structure of the ice beneath. A faint adjustment occurred within the glacier, subtle but unmistakable, as if internal pressure was being redistributed across a hidden network of fractures. A narrow channel of light extended deeper into the abyss, illuminating parts of the ice wall that had remained completely dark until this moment. David's gaze followed the light upward, unable to determine whether the environment was truly changing or whether his perception was fragmenting under extreme conditions. The leopard remained in place, perfectly still, as though waiting for a final alignment between movement, structure, and collapse before any further change could occur. David Carter remained inside the frozen abyss beneath the glacier, where the distinction between time and stillness had collapsed into a single continuous sensation of cold pressure and fading awareness. The narrow shaft of fractured ice above him continued to emit a faint, unstable glow, but it no longer felt like a connection to the surface world. Instead, it resembled a distant phenomenon occurring in another reality, observable but no longer accessible. His body had reached a critical state of exhaustion, where even maintaining consciousness required sustained effort, and each breath seemed to arrive later than expected, as if the body itself was no longer fully synchronized with survival. Despite this, his awareness remained fixed on the opening above, drawn not by hope in the traditional sense, but by the persistent presence of the leopard that still occupied the edge of the fracture. The animal had not left. Its continued presence defied expectation, not because it moved aggressively or dramatically, but because it maintained a consistent pattern of controlled observation and measured positioning along the rim of the ice. The storm outside the glacier continued without pause, yet within the narrow radius of the fracture, its effects appeared subtly altered whenever the leopard adjusted its position. Snow would shift differently, wind patterns would briefly stabilize, and the structural vibration of the ice would change in ways that suggested a relationship between movement and environment that should not have been possible. David observed this through a narrowing field of perception, his thoughts slowed by exhaustion, yet still capable of recognizing repetition and structure in what he was witnessing. The leopard lowered itself once again toward the edge of the abyss, bringing its body closer to the fracture as though reducing the distance between observer and subject. At that moment, a more noticeable shift occurred within the glacier. The ice above did not break or collapse, but instead reconfigured under internal pressure, redistributing stress along existing fracture lines. The narrow channel of light expanded slightly, allowing deeper visibility into the shaft and illuminating sections of ice that had previously remained completely opaque. David instinctively reached upward again, but his movement was weak, and the attempt failed before it could generate any meaningful ascent. His hand slid against the ice and returned to his side, leaving him suspended once more in near stillness. The leopard remained focused downward, unmoving, as if it was maintaining a specific state of alignment with the structure of the glacier itself. The surrounding storm outside continued to exert force upon the ice, yet the immediate area around the fracture appeared increasingly stabilized in response to the leopard's positioning. David's perception began to blur at the edges, but even within that fading clarity, he could recognize a pattern emerging that no longer resembled coincidence. The leopard's presence, its positioning, and the subtle structural changes within the glacier appeared interconnected in a way that suggested influence rather than observation. The light above strengthened slightly once more, extending deeper into the abyss in a controlled progression rather than a sudden change. The leopard held its position at the edge, motionless and attentive, as if waiting for a final threshold to be reached before any further action could occur. David Carter remained inside the frozen vertical abyss beneath the glacier, where the final stage of survival had shifted beyond physical endurance and into a narrowing corridor of awareness sustained only by fragmented consciousness and the faint persistence of external light filtering through fractured ice above. The shaft no longer felt like a structure, but like a suspended boundary between disappearance and return, its walls holding steady under immense environmental pressure while simultaneously reflecting subtle changes in distribution that suggested ongoing internal adjustment. David's body had reached a point of near immobility, where movement required more energy than the body could generate, leaving him suspended in a state of still observation rather than action. Each breath was shallow and delayed, as if the connection between intention and physical response had weakened under the intensity of cold exposure. Yet despite this progressive collapse of physical capacity, his attention remained fixed upward toward the narrow opening where the leopard still stood at the edge of the fracture. The animal had not withdrawn. Its presence had persisted through all prior structural changes in the glacier, maintaining a position that now appeared less like observation and more like stabilization. The leopard's posture remained low and controlled, oriented directly toward the abyss, with a level of focus that suggested continuity rather than reaction. Snow and wind continued to move violently across the surface of the glacier, but within the immediate perimeter surrounding the fracture, those forces appeared subtly modulated, as if their intensity was being redistributed across unseen boundaries in response to the leopard's positioning. David watched in silence as the narrow channel of light extending into the abyss began to shift once more. This time, the change was more gradual but also more sustained, expanding the illuminated region deeper into the ice shaft and revealing structural layers that had previously remained completely hidden. The glacier itself appeared to be reorganizing under internal pressure, not through collapse, but through controlled redistribution along pre-existing fractures. David attempted to lift his arm again, but the motion failed before it reached any meaningful height, and his hand returned to the ice wall with minimal resistance. His strength had diminished to the point where effort no longer produced measurable outcome. Above him, the leopard adjusted its position slightly, stepping closer to the edge without crossing it. This minor movement coincided with another subtle change in the ice structure, as the illuminated channel stabilized and extended further downward in a consistent line. The relationship between movement and environmental response had become increasingly difficult to interpret as coincidence. Instead, it resembled a system of alignment, where position and structure interacted in a continuous feedback loop. David's perception narrowed further, yet even within his fading clarity, he recognized that the abyss was no longer entirely static. It was responding. The leopard remained still once more, maintaining its focus downward as the light reached deeper into the shaft than at any previous moment. The surrounding storm continued above the glacier, but within the fracture, conditions had shifted into a rare and fragile stability that allowed visibility into the deepest portion of the ice column. David's awareness flickered between exhaustion and observation, and in that final narrowing field of perception, the leopard's presence at the edge of the abyss no longer appeared as an external witness, but as a central force maintaining equilibrium between collapse and continuity. David Carter remained inside the frozen vertical abyss beneath the glacier, now approaching the final threshold of awareness where physical sensation had nearly collapsed into a continuous field of cold pressure and fragmented perception. The narrow shaft of ice above him continued to function as the only remaining connection between the abyss and the surface world. But even that connection felt increasingly abstract, as if distance had become less a measure of space and more a distortion of consciousness. His body no longer responded with reliable coordination. Each attempted movement dissolved before it could form into action, leaving him suspended in a state of near stillness where survival was no longer defined by progress, but by persistence of awareness. Above him, the leopard remained at the edge of the fracture. Its position had not changed in any significant way, yet its presence carried an increasing sense of structural influence over the environment itself. The storm above the glacier continued with full intensity, but within the immediate boundary of the fracture, conditions remained selectively stable, as if the surrounding chaos was being redistributed around a fixed point of control. The narrow channel of light extending into the abyss had now reached its deepest and most stable configuration so far, illuminating layers of ice that revealed complex internal formations previously hidden by darkness. David's gaze remained locked upward, though his vision had begun to blur at the edges due to exhaustion and exposure. He could still perceive the leopard's silhouette clearly at the rim of the opening, its posture unchanged, its focus directed downward with unwavering consistency. Subtle changes continued to occur in correlation with its presence. When the leopard shifted its weight slightly, faint structural adjustments passed through the ice walls, not as fractures, but as controlled redistribution of pressure. The glacier no longer behaved as a static mass. Instead, it appeared responsive in a way that suggested internal coherence beyond natural instability. David attempted one final time to lift himself, but the movement failed almost immediately, leaving him unable to generate any upward force. His awareness of time had nearly dissolved, replaced by a continuous present state where each moment existed independently of the last. Above him, the leopard lowered its body marginally closer to the edge once again, maintaining precise alignment with the fracture opening. At that moment, the illuminated channel within the ice stabilized further, extending in a continuous line that reached deeper than any previous formation. The structural integrity of the surrounding ice did not collapse, but instead reorganized along invisible pathways, as if responding to a guiding influence rather than external force. David's perception, though weakened, registered this progression as a definitive shift rather than a temporary fluctuation. The environment was no longer simply reacting. It was coordinating. The leopard held its position, completely still, as if maintaining a critical equilibrium point between external environmental pressure and internal structural response within the glacier. The storm above continued to rage across the surface, yet its effects no longer penetrated the fracture in a uniform manner. Instead, they were filtered, redirected, and redistributed in patterns that corresponded directly with the leopard's stillness and movement. David's consciousness flickered between fading awareness and forced observation, but even in that diminished state, he recognized the transformation occurring above him. The abyss was no longer a closed system of collapse. It had become a controlled interface between destruction and stability, and at its center stood the unmoving presence of the leopard, maintaining a balance that defied simple explanation. As the final channel of light stabilized at maximum depth, David Carter remained inside the frozen vertical abyss beneath the glacier, now entering a phase where perception itself had become the only remaining structure holding him within reality. The narrow shaft of fractured ice above him continued to function as a fragile conduit between the abyss and the surface world, but even that connection had shifted in meaning. It no longer represented escape or direction, only a controlled passage of light and pressure through a system that was no longer behaving in a purely natural manner. His body had reached an extreme state of depletion, where physical effort no longer produced meaningful response and consciousness itself felt suspended between observation and dissolution. Each breath was shallow and irregular, yet still present, marking the only remaining distinction between existence and disappearance. Above him, the leopard remained at the edge of the fracture. Its presence had become increasingly central to the behavior of the surrounding environment, not through force, but through consistency. The storm above the glacier continued with full intensity, yet within the immediate radius of the fracture, its effects were no longer uniform. Wind patterns bent subtly around the opening, and snowfall behaved in irregular trajectories that suggested localized deviation from natural flow. The channel of light that extended into the abyss had stabilized into a defined vertical path, illuminating the deepest visible layers of ice with a clarity that had not been present earlier. David's gaze remained fixed upward despite his weakening condition. The leopard's silhouette was sharply defined against the shifting brightness, its posture unchanged and deliberate. It did not pace or shift unpredictably. Instead, it maintained a precise position that appeared to correspond with subtle changes in the glacier's internal structure. Whenever it adjusted its stance by even a minimal degree, faint structural responses traveled through the ice walls below, not as fractures, but as controlled redistribution of internal pressure. The glacier no longer behaved as a passive frozen mass. It exhibited a form of regulated responsiveness that aligned with the leopard's presence in ways that could not be easily attributed to coincidence. David attempted to move again, but the action failed before it could begin, leaving him suspended in absolute stillness. His awareness of time had nearly collapsed, replaced by a continuous present state in which each moment existed without reference to the next. Above him, the leopard lowered itself slightly closer to the edge once more, maintaining direct alignment with the illuminated channel. At that precise moment, the structure of the ice shifted again. The change was not destructive but reorganizational, as if internal stress points were being redistributed across predetermined paths within the glacier. The illuminated channel extended further downward, revealing additional depth and structural complexity within the ice column. David's perception registered the change as definitive rather than incidental. The environment was no longer responding randomly to external storm pressure. Instead, it appeared to be operating within a coordinated system of adjustments, where movement, pressure, and stability were linked through a consistent pattern of interaction. The leopard remained motionless after the adjustment, holding its position at the rim of the fracture with unwavering focus. The storm above continued to exert force upon the surface of the glacier, but its influence within the fracture remained selectively moderated, as if filtered through an invisible boundary defined by the leopard's presence. David's consciousness flickered between clarity and fading awareness, yet even in that unstable state, he could recognize the structural transformation occurring around him. The abyss was no longer a simple containment of ice and collapse. It had become a dynamically balanced system, where stability was actively maintained rather than passively preserved, and at its center stood the unmoving leopard, sustaining an equilibrium that held the final extension of light steady deep within the glacier. David Carter remained inside the frozen vertical abyss beneath the glacier, now at the final stage where perception, structure, and environmental response had converged into a single continuous system of controlled stability. The narrow shaft of fractured ice above him no longer behaved like a simple opening, but like a precisely maintained channel through which light, pressure, and motion were being regulated in carefully balanced proportions. His body had reached a critical threshold of exhaustion, where physical response was no longer functional in any meaningful sense, leaving him suspended in a state of near-complete stillness. Yet even in this diminished condition, his awareness remained fixed upward, drawn toward the only remaining point of coherence within the collapsing world of cold and silence. Above him, the leopard still stood at the edge of the fracture. Its presence had become the central stabilizing factor within the entire system of the glacier's internal behavior. The storm outside continued to rage across the surface with full intensity, but its effects no longer penetrated the fracture in a chaotic manner. Instead, external pressure was being redirected and absorbed into structural pathways within the ice, creating a controlled redistribution of force that maintained the integrity of the illuminated channel. David could no longer determine whether he was witnessing natural phenomenon or an emergent form of environmental coordination, but the consistency of the pattern left little room for randomness. The leopard remained completely still for a prolonged moment, its body aligned precisely with the edge of the opening. At that exact point, the glacier underwent its final measurable transition. The illuminated channel stabilized into a continuous vertical path extending deep into the abyss, revealing the full structural depth of the ice column. Internal fractures no longer expanded unpredictably, but instead settled into a fixed configuration that appeared to lock the system into a stable state. David's perception, though severely weakened, registered this change as absolute rather than gradual. The environment had reached equilibrium. The leopard did not move. Its posture remained steady and focused, maintaining what now appeared to be a critical point of balance between external storm force and internal structural stability. Snow and wind continued to move across the surface of the glacier, but their influence within the fracture had been fully regulated. David attempted no further movement. His body no longer responded with meaningful resistance or action, leaving him in complete stillness within the lower abyss. Yet his awareness persisted just long enough to observe the final condition of the system above him. The leopard